IVM.
Hi, welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. 125 years ago, Bombay was hit by a deadly disease, the plague. No one had ever seen anything like this. People were dying in large numbers every day, and the hospitals were full of patients. The plague was not limited to Bombay city. It spread throughout the presidency, which also meant Ahmedabad, Karachi, and parts of what is now Karnataka, and even beyond into North India. By the time it ended, million plus people had died. The Colonial administration, which ran Bombay, took matters in hand and went about its task of containing the disease with clinical ruthlessness. Crowded homes were demolished, people were displaced, and entire areas were cleaned up. In the end, however, a newly laid out city emerged. In his book, The Making of an Indian Metropolis, our guest, Dr. Prashant Kidambi, who is Assistant Professor of Colonial Urban History at the University of Leicester, has traced the genesis and aftermath of the plague when new roads, suburbs, and a new way of living was born. Welcome to the Wire Talks, Dr. Kidambi.
Thank you so much, Sidharth.
We are doing this interview with the COVID pandemic still raging around us. Are there any parallels with the plague, at least for the residents of Mumbai?
Yes, I think one can see very interesting parallels between the current pandemic and what happened in Bombay 125 years ago. One is clearly this disease is, it's an unknown disease, or it was an unknown disease when it first broke out, and much was not known about its causation. If you remember in the early months when COVID-19 was identified, there were all kinds of theories put forward about its transmission and so on. And this was also true of the outbreak of plague in Bombay, which was discovered in September 1896. When it first was identified, there were great debates within the colonial medical establishment about what caused the disease. Rival theories contended with each other in trying to explain its mode of transmission and so on. So at one level, we can then see in terms of identifying the way the disease spread, the causation of the disease, there's a great deal of uncertainty both in the current scenario and what happened then. Of course, modern science has advanced so rapidly that today we've been able to find a vaccine in less than a year, and that was largely possible because much about the disease was established very quickly through the thousands of scientific papers that were produced since it broke out. Whereas in the case of the plague, it took a much longer time for the scientific consensus about its causation, which is the idea that it was, the realization that it was caused by the rat flea. That took a long time to be established. The second element is not so much medical as social. As often happens in these kinds of situations, the identification of a pandemic and the news that a pandemic was spreading caused panic across different sections of society. We saw that with the case of COVID, and this was also true in the case of the Bombay plague. So much as happened with the scenes that we saw during the lockdown with migrants fleeing the cities for back to their villages and towns. Something similar happened even in the case of the plague. The Bombay's residents, many of whom were migrants, tried to flee back to their home villages to escape the disease. We can also see it not simply at the level of social responses, but also in relation to the attitude of the states, the policies of the government. We saw how when the current pandemic began to intensify, how there was a very draconian set of laws that were brought in. One of those was very interesting. It was the Epidemic Diseases Act of February 1897. And as the date suggests, that law was originally brought in to deal with the plague in Bombay. And you talked in your introduction about the crackdown by the state in terms of trying to stamp out the disease. And this was also the case with the Bombay plague. So at the level of medical theories of causation, at the level of social responses, and at the level of the government's own attitude, I think we can see very interesting parallels.
Yeah. So a large number of people died in the space of a few months. Different sources give different numbers, but the question is, how did it spread so fast?
Let me start with the last point first. The plague was not confined only to Bombay presidency. It spread across the whole subcontinent. Its effects were felt dramatically in Western India, but it also spread to Northern India, Central India, and parts of South India. And I think sort of there are estimates of the fatalities, and conservative estimate, I think, would put it at around 12 million people who were killed between 1896 and 1914 when the First World War broke out. So it was a dramatic, it had a dramatic impact on India in the early 20th century. And as I said, the fatality rate was quite significant, which then suggests that, as I said, that this was not a disease that could be contained in the boundaries, within the boundaries of a city or even the presidency. As far as how it was spread, I suppose the answer must be that by this time you have modern modes of transport, communication. Bombay itself, where it was first identified, was one of the great hubs of Indian capitalism by this time, so and with a large migrant population. So it is possible that as people began to flee the city, that the disease traveled with them. It's also possible that attempts to stamp out the disease, in fact, may in the first instance have acted to further spread it outwards, as it were. But we still don't know enough about how exactly the disease moved and how it was that it came to engulf the whole subcontinent. I would imagine that it was through the circuits of trade, migration, and commerce.
Now, the colonial government, using the police, went about demolishing homes in Bombay. I think the narrative was clearly that the natives were living unhygienically in crowded neighborhoods, many to a small area, maybe a room and a half, and they were living in unsanitary conditions. Now, obviously, there was an implication that, or one can draw a conclusion that there was an implication that these are natives and they do not live by modern methods. A lot of historians have called that entire process of demolishing homes and displacing people, burning down old houses and clothes and things as high-handedness, even racist. But looking back and looking dispassionately, did the administration have any alternative?
That's an interesting question. I think there's no doubting that the colonial government's intervention in local society in order to stamp out the plague was the most dramatic example of state authoritarianism in India until that point. In fact, the plague was the single biggest crisis confronted by the colonial government since the rebellion of 1857, the Great Rebellion of 1857. At one level, you can argue that this was not so much symptomatic of how colonial authorities generally behaved, that it was an unprecedented intervention. And the reason I say this is today we think of the colonial government exercising its authoritarianism in a constant fashion, that it was a pervasive and persistent feature of colonial rule. But what is actually quite interesting is that the way the colonial authorities actually governed many of their cities and towns was through a form of indirect rule. In other words, the colonial authorities did not have the wherewithal or the inclination to intervene directly in the affairs of local neighborhoods if they could help it. They tended to govern through caste headmen, community leaders, and so on. And by and large, they only intervened when these leaderships could not keep their constituencies in check. It was only when a crisis happened and these leaderships, local leaderships, found themselves helpless that the colonial government then had to step in and restore authority. We saw this, for example, with the 1893 riots in Bombay, where the colonial authorities had no idea that a riot of this scale was going to break out. It was a massive riot, one of the major urban riots of the late 19th century. And that was a failure of local leaderships, and then the colonial authorities had to step in to restore order in some ways. So by and large, the colonial authorities tended to get dragged into these local conflicts, which they tried to manage, as I said, through intermediaries and Indian customary headmen and so on. The plague represents a departure because for the first time you had a crisis that could not be dealt locally. You had to have some kind of coordinated central response. And that meant that you had to simply crack down because the sheer anxiety and panic generated by the disease, especially not simply only for the Indian population, but also especially for the European population who had all these ideas of the Black Death and so on. See, so the plague, even though diseases were quite common in Bombay, Bombay had an extremely high death rate in the late 19th century. The plague was still different in the colonial imagination because of all these associations, as I said, with its history in Europe. So this combined, the fear of the disease and the fact that needed a coordinated central response meant that the colonial authorities had to tear up their existing systems of governing the city. They had to get into the neighborhoods. They had to start destroying things because of their idea that the plague was to be found in these sorts of localities. And this, just as a sort of a digression here, but the reason they all had to kind of crack down on these neighborhoods was that you had a very persistent and very influential understanding of the disease in Bombay amongst the medical authorities. That plague was a disease of locality, that it was basically not a contagious disease in the ordinary sense. It does not spread automatically between person to person. That plague resided in insanitary neighborhoods. You had what I've called in my book a localist perspective. And this had a long provenance in Bombay, which was actually strengthened by the evidence that they found in Bombay of plague breaking out initially in areas close to the docks, which are also, of course, the working class areas of the city. And so you have this sense that plague lurks in the slums of Bombay. And until the 1890s, the colonial authorities had turned a blind eye to these slums, what they called slums. We should be careful of the terminology that they use. But what they saw as slums, these sort of insanitary housing in which the working classes live, the colonial authorities tended to ignore it. But the plague forced their hand. They couldn't ignore it anymore because if they turned a blind eye to it, the entire future of the city was at stake. So you see all this coming together and leading to this extraordinary moment when the colonial authorities jettison their policy of indirect governance, they jettison their policy of civic indifference, and they have to mount a concerted frontal assault on the disease. And that then leads them to not discriminate in terms of the crackdown. And it is also the reason why the plague generates so much popular resistance. But as far as final part of your question goes, was this in a sense inevitable? I think in terms of how the colonial authorities saw the disease and their understanding of it and the panic, I think they had no choice. They had to deal with it. So in a sense, it arose out of this particular conjuncture, I think.
Yeah. Local community leaders said that the colonial administration was interfering in community matters like caste, like class, like religious practices. There have been suggestions by historians since that this intervention was also racist. How would you see it, Prashant?
Yes. Now, I think there is no doubt about the racism of the colonial authorities at this point in time. We have to remember this was the high noon of empire at a time in which racist attitudes were rife. It was one of the biggest areas of contention between the Indian nationalists and the colonial authorities, the racism of the colonial establishment in India. So there's no doubt at all that the racism was a fact, and that indeed their perceptions, the colonial perceptions about Indian society shaped their responses in significant ways. That said, I think what is interesting is that there is also a class dimension in all of this, which is that the Indian elites of the city too came to look at the poor with a great deal of anxiety and antipathy. So while race is absolutely central, I think one should not also forget the growing significance of class. And in fact, in my forthcoming work, I'm showing how it is around this time that you begin to see Indian elites taking a greater, more prominent role in the remaking of cities. And we will see this with the Bombay Improvement Trust, which opens up opportunities for Indian magnates and Indian property classes to insert themselves within the politics of urban development. And there's a whole class dimension to this, which is very much centered on, as I said, a suspicion and a distaste for the Indian poor and the working classes.
Yeah, actually, that really brings me to the next question, which was about the Bombay Improvement Trust, because your book really concentrates on that part in a substantial way. And it's 100 years old, Bombay Improvement Trust, but what it did is with us even today. So tell us a bit about this BIT in a very kind of simple way for us to understand what it was all about, because the word improvement by itself suggests something.
I'm glad you raised this question, Sidharth, because I think the Bombay Improvement Trust and its work deserves to be known more widely than it is. Historians of Bombay, of course, know it. I'm not so sure whether residents of Bombay are really aware of how significant this trust was in the remaking of Bombay in the early 20th century. In fact, we can see evidence of this all around us even today in Bombay's built environment. Many of the buildings that we pass, in central and South Bombay were constructed by the Improvement Trust. So let me begin by saying that the logic for creating an Improvement Trust is very much tied up with the point that I made earlier, which is that there was a very influential strand of medical opinion in Bombay which believed that the plague was a product of Bombay slums. And that if you had to deal with the plague, and as I said, the term slum is a pejorative one, but this is the language of the time, so I'm just using it, but you can see it in quotation marks, as it were. So these insanitary houses of the poor, the dwellings of the poor, were seen as a key reason why the plague had spread in the way it had. And so it became very clear to the colonial authorities that if they needed to tackle the plague, they had to do something about the civic infrastructure of the city, and especially the housing of the working classes, who by this time had come to become a preponderant element in the city. Now, of course, until this point in time, the colonial authorities had not really paid attention to the civic infrastructure of the city outside of South Bombay. In other words, outside of the elite areas, there was very little civic investment, and certainly the working classes lived in abysmal conditions. And there was no reason until this point for the colonial government to invest in it, because the whole logic of colonialism is to extract resources from the colony, not put it in. But the plague changed the game, because now suddenly the future of this important metropolis, this one of the key urban centers in India, which rivaled Calcutta for the status of the second city of empire, its entire future depended on doing something about the civic infrastructure, because there was a real fear that plague would put an end to Bombay's trade, it would drive away all the migrants, that basically the city would become a shell of what it was. So out of that fear, out of that panic, came the imperative to do something about the civic infrastructure, and that leads to the creation of the Bombay Improvement Trust. The trust is formed in November 1898, and it is really formed like an extension of a government department for most intents and purposes. In other words, the trust was largely dominated by colonial officials, and you could see how, at one level, the trust inaugurated a tradition of urban development that persists to this day, and which is the attempt to bypass accountability to local civic, popularly elected or civic representatives, and use executive fiat to push through urban development. We often see today, a variety of parastatal institutions, all kinds of development agencies which are democratically not accountable to anyone. That tradition really goes back to the Bombay Improvement Trust, because the trust is vested with the task of remaking Bombay, demolishing old houses, driving through new wide streets, bringing down the tenements of the poor and erecting new housing for the working classes, opening up new areas of the city and developing it so that it can then become the sites for new housing, reclaiming land from the sea. So it was a comprehensive vision. But this vision was not entrusted to the Bombay Municipal Corporation, which by this time was the representative of civic authority in the city. It was created to deal with this grand agenda of civic reconstruction. And the Improvement Trust becomes a key player in reshaping Bombay. It begins to undertake all these tasks that it is set out. And what is very interesting, of course, is that, in a sense, the core principle that governs many of the trust's activities is that of eminent domain, that the state can take over private land for public purposes. And this is, again, a principle that is very significant with regard to the state's role in urban development today. Now, the trust, as I said, comes out of this desire to deal with the civic infrastructure, comes out of the panic generated by the plague. And initially, it does try to carry out this agenda. So there's an attempt to create housing for the working classes. There are attempts to build new streets, to improve circulation, and so on. Many later historians, or the historians who've actually looked at this, have tended to assume that the trust was an example of efficient state action. In my own book, I've taken a different view. I've highlighted the many contradictions that dogged the functioning of the trust. On the one hand, the trust starts off with this desire to create sanitary housing for the working classes, but as its operations begin to proceed and the panic of the plague recedes, they increasingly find that this, creating working class housing is an expensive proposition. It's not a paying proposition, because the people you're building the houses for can't afford the rents you want to charge them. So gradually that element of the agenda is discarded. The attempts to take over private land get bogged down in battles over compensation claims. There's no precedent for the kind of activities that the trust is undertaking. So they have to come up with, principles of compensation and so on. that are suited to the specific context of Bombay. And of course, they find that, the methods they start off with don't work, so they have to recast those. They encounter local resistance at different levels. The people whose houses are taken away resist. Members of the municipal corporation, Indian members of the municipal corporations voice their resentment and resistance. The press, the Indian press is deeply critical of the trust. Many of Bombay's property magnates, even as they're benefiting from the activities of the trust, are at the same time also critical of the way it goes about its functioning. Above all, there was great resentment in Bombay, which had by now come to enjoy a certain degree of civic prestige and civic vibrancy because of the establishment and entrenchment of municipal representative government. There was great anxiety at one level, but also great anger amongst the educated Indian middle classes who were taking to the Bombay Municipal Corporation and begun to take part in civic politics. There was great anger that the state was rolling back this concession to representative government by imposing this bureaucratic authority to carry forward the activities of the Improvement Trust. And of course, in the final analysis, if one looks at the trust's activities purely in terms of what it was meant to achieve and what it did, I think the failures are quite stark. But at the same time, I also argue in the book that failure doesn't mean not doing anything. It just means doing something else from what you set out to achieve. And in the case of the trust, the failure was actually quite productive because it had all kinds of unintended consequences for urban development in Bombay. It transformed Bombay in ways that it had not perhaps anticipated at the outset. And it generated a new dynamic in the property market. It generated a new dynamic in schemes for urban development. The Improvement Trust becomes the first sort of such instance of state intervention in the in schemes of urban development, and it becomes the model for subsequent trusts. So across India, this Improvement Trust model is followed, and in fact, I think it's the first such attempt even in the whole of Asia. So the Bombay model is adopted, in British India, but also elsewhere. So the trust has both important consequences for the future urban development of Bombay, but it also has important consequences for urban development in other parts of the colonized world.
In fact, coming specifically to some of the things we see around us today, instead of kind of a more institutionalized benefits or effects, if we see it physically, and there are, people in Bombay, of course, know about them, but perhaps others have heard that. So you have something like a link road between the east and the west, that is Belasses Road. You have the middle class or rather low middle class colonies, which then eventually become upper middle class of Dadar, Sion and beyond. And those areas still have wide roads, they have gardens, they have roundabouts, and they have trees, and they have generally a very salubrious way of living in this city, which is quite unusual for a back dense city. So there are real outcomes which are beneficial, even if they are intended or not. The Parsis got, space for themselves. These were poor Parsis. Hindu colony, for example, or certain castes and subcastes also have housing in Matunga. So again, my question is, we take these things for granted today and say, what a lovely area. But this was a fallout of the Port Trust activities, wasn't it?
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. And I would say that in highlighting the failures of the trust, as I said, the argument is not that the trust didn't achieve anything. It is that it did achieve something, but what it achieved was perhaps contrary to what the original aims of the trust were. And that also its functioning was dogged by all kinds of contradictions. But I've already spoken about that. Let me just turn to the points you've made. I think one of the interesting things to my mind about the trust and its impact is that although one of its key objectives was the creation of sanitary housing for the working classes, in fact, the biggest beneficiary of the trust policies were the lower middle and middle classes of Bombay. Because first of all, the tenements that the trusts erected, the buildings that the trust erected, came to be occupied not by the laboring classes, it came to be occupied by the lower middle class and the middle classes, because the rents that the trust wanted to charge to make the whole operation feasible, economically feasible, were unaffordable as far as the working classes were concerned. So you find, the middle classes being the biggest beneficiaries. And that is the case even more so. It is the case with regard to these suburban areas that you just talked about. And here we actually see how much of the trust's activities and efficacy and significance comes out of the actions of the Indians who are the objects of its actions, in a sense. So if you think of all these middle-class areas, Dadar and Sion and so on, Matunga, etc., it is the communities who come to live in these areas who actually transform, through their actions, they shape these into the suburban areas or the suburbs, as they were known at the time. It's these communities that really shape these areas. They move into these areas and they shape it through their agency, through their actions. Of course, the trusts created the framework, and I would say that in a sense, they were probably more successful in this regard in terms of the framework that they created for these suburbs than they were in their initial activities in South and Central Bombay. Because there they dishoused more people than they rehoused. They ended up demolishing far more buildings than they were able to erect. And I suppose the criticism there would be that had the trust been really genuinely radical, had it been a less bureaucratic authority, had it been perhaps not the creation of the colonial government, it might have achieved so much more. Because at the end of the day, what brought the trust short was that it was not able to carry through on its own ostensible aims. Because constantly, the contradiction at the heart of the trust's operation was between the need for efficacy in urban development versus the need to preserve economy. So economy versus efficacy is the constant tension, and constantly in the colonial context, you find it is economy that is privileged over efficacy. So in the end, you could see how the trust rode back from many of its original intentions. It tried to penny pinch. It tried to involve private employers in the housing market and so on. So I suppose the biggest criticism about the trust would be that it was not radical enough, and it couldn't be given the context in which it functioned.
One of the things that strikes me when I read your book, and then so much more I've read post the BIT, and the BIT eventually got merged. But if you read what happens later, there is the Back Bay Reclamation Scheme. Many examples I can give you since then in independent India, where it starts out with all kinds of pious intentions and making housing, etc., for the poor. And then the elite moves in and somehow appropriates that. Because even Back Bay Reclamation, which is now our pride and joy and, full of expensive old apartments in Marine Drive, etc., did have some more democratic spirit, but that was never realized.
Yes. And of course, people have forgotten, but the story has been told by some historians. Most recently, Jan Prakash in his book, Mumbai Fables, it was the object of a great scandal. The scheme became mired in controversy in the 20s and early 30s. But you're absolutely right that what we see with all these attempts at civic reordering, whether it's the Bombay Improvement Trust or what comes afterwards, is the announcement of a grand vision, the attempt to outline a grand plan, and that plan or those intentions coming up against the realities of politics, the realities of the built environment, coming up against the realities of local structures of power, and so on. And I think what is very interesting is to see how these initiatives at remaking cities are often, in their visions, often tend to be very abstract. They tend to discount all of it. And then when they confront it, they tend to be unprepared for it. Sometimes what they have to confront is overt. It takes the form of resistance. But at other times, what they have to confront are the contradictions that are implicit in their own visions, which are not thought through. And I think that is a recurring pattern. And the Improvement Trust really inaugurates this tradition of both these sorts of the contradictory logics on which urban development is founded, but also the wider realities within which it is enmeshed. And I think any future attempt at remaking cities will go the same way if it doesn't reflect more critically on these sorts of issues. And we can see this. One of the recent examples that I've been mulling on greatly is the attempt to create this new city of Amaravati. It's a grand scheme, and it has gone completely to ground. And, someday a historian will look at this and wonder, what the story was here, And I think the heart of the matter is the tension between the vision and the reality within which that vision has to operate.
So actually, which brings me to a point that a few people have already started thinking about in India, and certainly in the context of Bombay, Do you think that the COVID pandemic will result in rethinking and reimagining urban planning? Because initially, when it started, after that, when everyone was groping in the dark, it emerged that Dharavi, for example, and in certain other areas, also slums, were showing a rapid escalation in patient numbers. And Dharavi has been a classic example of governments trying to say, let's try and improve it. And it never gets improved. It's always been what it is. And I presume it will remain like that for a while. And of course, that changed because Dharavi became, the herd immunity took over. And it's much better planned and much better run and much better handled. COVID is now fizzled out there and it moved to elite areas. But do you think there will be some official and even among urban planners a rethinking of reordering and reimagining what Bombay should be like? Perhaps more housing, more sanitation in certain areas, and really a new way of looking at the future.
Yes, you would think that that would be the case. But there are several parts to this question and the other comments that you just made. One is, let me just start with the case of Dharavi. I think Dharavi is a classic example of how idea of the slum, and I put the term slum again in quotation marks, the idea of the slum exercises such a deep influence on our ways of thinking about cities, especially in relation to disease, because it reflects how we automatically imagine that the slums will be where the diseases will sprout up and proliferate and become deeply entrenched. This is a long-standing tradition. It goes back all the way to the mid-19th century where the colonial authorities started producing reports on the health of the city. So you have a section called the Health Officers Report, which is there in every annual report of the Municipal Commissioner of Bombay going all the way back to the mid-19th century. And there was a long tradition of associating the working class neighborhoods with prevalence of disease. Now, this had some basis in fact, but it was also a certain way of thinking about disease and the urban poor. And Dharavi is a classic example of an exception which shows how so much of our understandings are based on these sorts of constructions, because it was assumed that Dharavi would be quickly overrun. It was assumed that as an area with a large slum-dwelling population, that this would be wiped out by COVID because it was so receptive to, it was so, in a sense, all the conditions for the spread of COVID were present in Dharavi. And yet we saw that that wasn't the case. Because in the case of Dharavi, you saw how good local management working in tandem with the health authorities on the ground and the residents of these tenements, how they were able to stave off this crisis in a way that actually other centers have not been able to do. Now, coming to this question of whether one will learn from this and whether there will be a new vision for urban development, I personally am very skeptical that COVID will be the trigger for such a rethinking. And the reason for that is, this is not a disease that is locality specific. It's a disease that can spread in a very random way. It's transmitted in ways that are not localized, as it were. You can be in a high-rise apartment, you can be in the White House, and you can still get it. So which then means that if you had to remake cities in response to COVID, you would have to completely, transform the entire structure, which is not going to happen. Urban development, which is centered on remaking the civic infrastructure of the insanitary parts of the city and so on, would only make sense if the disease was to be proved to exist only in those parts and nowhere else. I actually think that COVID's impact on urban residents, on cities, is going to be more in the kinds of social practices that it has already generated. If you think of, wearing masks, social distancing, washing your hands, etc., all of these practices will become part of our lives, I think, going forward, even when we have a vaccine. Because you can still get the disease and, keeping social distance and wearing masks, I think, will become part of our everyday routines as urbanites and city dwellers. I actually think that the real trigger or the requirement to rethink our cities comes from a very different quarter, and that is climate change. I think what we are seeing in Indian cities is a problem that is becoming more and more pressing and is probably going to be even more severe than COVID. Because COVID, once a vaccine is found, will allow us to regain some parts of our previous existence, if not entirely, at least to a substantial degree. We hope. We don't know, but I think that is the hope. But I think the problems that climate change is going to present to our cities is really staggering when one thinks of it. I mean, think of the instances of urban floods. these have become increasingly more frequent across Indian cities, whether it's Chennai or Hyderabad or Bangalore or other cities. The civic infrastructure of these cities is simply not fit for purpose in terms of dealing with these sorts of challenges. It's not simply flooding, it's also instances of heat waves, the electricity consumption in our cities, the effects of pollution, the way in which urban development is increasingly colonizing all, the green spaces of cities. So it seems to me that is the real challenge. And there I'm not entirely clear, if there is a real political will to bring together different stakeholders and effect this kind of transformation, because this really calls for a very big, coordinated, comprehensive vision. I'm just not sure whether there is the political will to undertake it. I think you will hear lots of lip service paid to those ideals, but I'm not sure that this is something that the political class, which is really, where much of this transformation can happen. I mean, the citizenry can make claims, but I think until those in power actually take this up as a challenge and something that needs to be addressed immediately with urgency, I'm not sure if that is going to happen.
So, in fact, I wouldn't want to end this wonderfully comprehensive discussion with your great context and perspective and historical, the kind of things that you have talked about. I don't want to end it on a pessimistic note. So one can only say that, or one can only think that perhaps these are things that more and more people will start getting, because Dharavi showed there are many other examples. Now we are seeing citizen action here, that ultimately citizens will have to step in and force governments to take decisions. Perhaps that may be the way forward.
Yes, and I would actually say I would also not like to end on a pessimistic note. And I think what you said was exactly what I would have said too, or what I was going to say, which is that, you have this sort of these challenges that increasingly force us to, think pessimistically about the future of cities. But on the other hand, one can also see new forms of urban activism. I mean, the city that I travel a lot to, Hyderabad, has activist groups like Hyderabad Urban Labs, for example, where people are coming together, people from different walks of life with very different intellectual orientations coming together and engaging in bottom-up local action. And in fact, this too has a long tradition. The second part of my book is really about that local tradition of civic activism in Indian cities. And that is also a history that goes back well over 100 years. I mean, this is a tradition that drew in the first Indian nationalists, for example. And this is a tradition of citizenship, civic activism, and this idea that cities should be inclusive, democratic, environmentally friendly places. And it's a vision that I think countless activists over the years have dedicated their lives to. And I think it is that tradition that we have to pin our hopes on. And I'm very optimistic that in this coming generation, I think the awareness of these challenges and the importance of climate change is far more than it has ever been before. And I think that will hopefully propel a change from below. Because the point I want to end on is we often have a vision of Indian cities, and this is something that has been entrenched in the academic writings on cities too. We tend to see cities as really being created from above. And what we forget is cities are created even more from below than they are from above. In fact, as I was pointing out earlier, those in power might have visions of how they might want to reorder cities, but how cities actually shape up and what form they take is very much the product of the actions of their residents. And it is in recognizing that power and the transformative possibilities of that power that I think our own future lies. The better possibilities of our own future lie there, I think.
Oh, thank you very much, Prashant. That was Dr. Prashant Kidambi of the University of Leicester, talking about the plague, the parallels with COVID, and how the colonial administration handled it, and how the present government and present establishment are also looking at it, and how citizen agency is eventually going to be a big, hopeful movement for the future. Thank you, Prashant, for joining us at the Wire Talks.
Thank you so much, Sidharth, for having me on the show. Really enjoyed talking to you.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's been an absolutely incredible week on the network. We had so many great guests, so many great episodes. Advertising is dead. We had Faye D'Souza on. Varun took a break for 4 weeks, but what a bang he's back with. Sidharth Deshmukh celebrates the 100th episode of The Traveling Professor. It is an amazing show which I cannot say enough good things about. Please do listen to it. And a different Sidharth on the network, Sidharth Bhatia. He's just been absolutely guest after guest, right? This week, Zoya Akhtar talking about Gully Boy. I couldn't imagine a more interesting conversation. Ragini Kumar is on 2 different episodes this week. She is on Cyrus Says and she is on Edges and Sledges, both in anticipation of her new show, Zindagi Diaries. Do check out her appearance on both of those shows and her new show as well. Tanvi and Shloko, the Millennial Athlete, had a phenomenal episode with Dinesh Karthik and Abhishek Nair. Absolutely riveting stuff, talking about mentorship in many different ways. Definitely do give that a listen. And finally, I have a request to all of you. We have our listener survey going out this week. Every year we send out a listener survey at the end of the year. We're doing it again this year. And we would really appreciate your help in letting us know a little bit more about yourself. Our advertisers are really keen to find out who is listening to us and more about them. Anything that you could do is kept anonymously, and we would really appreciate your help in this. And to sweeten the pot just a little bit, we'll be giving a randomly selected group of participants in the survey some IBM swag. Last year we gave out coffee mugs. What we're going to give out this year is still a surprise. So please do help us out. Would really appreciate that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.